Hello, welcome. My name is Manuel Manga, and I am one of the co-founders of the Institute for Evolutionary Leadership here in Oakland, California. Today I'm going to be talking and explaining one of the competencies of an evolutionary leadership, which is the competency that we call ontological designing. And so today this will be a video that we're making for our community to be able to share with you how you can understand and apply this competency of ontological designing. First of all, I'd like to then explain what it is and how we can apply it, because I think it's one of the most important competencies that we can have, not only as an evolutionary leader, but as a human being, because it is a competency that can be applied in many areas of life or in many domains of life. So it has a very wide systemic application. So I first learned about ontological designing from one of my teachers, Fernando Flores, who's written about it and has also practiced ontological design in many different areas. Later on, I also learned about ontological designing from some of my other teachers like John Ehrenfeld, and also people like Anne-Marie Willis, a philosopher, and most lately Tony Fry, an Australian philosopher and architect. So the good news is there are more and more people understanding and applying ontological designing, because we really, as you're going to see, we really could use it in being able to redesign our world today, which is in a crisis. So the first thing that I'd like to cover is that there are several, you could say, limiting thoughts that people have about design. And one of those limiting thoughts that people have about design in general is that only some people are educated to be designers. Only some people, like you have to go to some kind of design school, or like architecture, for example, or graphic design. So the word design in our current vocabulary, in our current interpretation, has a very specific and I would say narrow interpretation, because it is mostly focused on the design of objects, of things like cars and phones and buildings, etc. And so most people don't see themselves as designers. So that's one limiting belief that people have. So we need to transform that, and that's what this competency does. It invites you to become a designer, and a specific kind of designer, which we're going to talk about. The second limiting belief is that most people, when they see the world today, when they see our culture, or they see our government, or they see our society, or they see our world, they think it was made by in the past or some people, but they don't necessarily see that it is a product of design, that actually someone designed this society that we live in, this culture. For example, the United States Constitution was designed by the so-called founding fathers, people like Jefferson and Hamilton and others. So they designed the structure, the narrative, the interpretation of what it means to be a society, what it means to be an American citizen, what it means to be a United States of America. So that's an example of design. But most people see that as society was built by somebody else and it's not my choice or my responsibility. So that's the second limiting belief. The third and important limiting belief is that people more and more are aware that we are in the middle of a global crisis. a global crisis that is systemic in nature. And this global crisis, which, for example, has things like climate change, and which is going to put everyone in peril, or other types of environmental damages or poverty, for example. They see this global crisis as something that was created by some other country, some other people, some other government, and they don't necessarily think that it is the product of design. So that's the third limiting belief. So we here at the Institute for Evolutionary Leadership, we have a specific purpose. So I'll start by first the macro, which is the purpose. So our purpose is to develop evolutionary leaders who can design and redesign worldviews, mindsets, cultures, institutions. All of those could be redesigned and reinvented. And we do that so that we can design and build a just, sustainable, flourishing world. So that is our purpose, to contribute to the social evolution of a just, sustainable, and flourishing world. But in order to do that, we have to redesign our mindsets, our cultures, and our institutions. So as you are going to see in a few minutes, this opens a huge window of opportunity for everyone to become evolutionary leaders and to become ontological designers. So now that I have given you this broad perspective, I'll draw it for you briefly. So for example, I'll draw this little diagram, which is one of my favorites. And in this diagram here, I talk here about the industrial era. And this industrial era is where we are today. This is where we are today, in the industrial era. And this is the industrial era that it is taking us toward a possible collapse if we keep going the way that we are going. And this industrial era is also by nature unsustainable. So this industrial era is unsustainable. So what do we need to do as evolutionary leaders? We need to design a conscious evolution to a different era that I'm going to call an era that it is just, sustainable, and flourishing world. So this is the future that our purpose invites us to create and to design. To go from this industrial era, which is not sustainable, to this one that is just sustainable and flourishing world. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by redesigning three big systems. One is our worldview, because each and every one of us has a particular worldview, and the worldview that we have today is a product of the industrial era. So it doesn't work for us. We need to redesign our cultures, because our cultures have a huge impact how we see the world, how we behave, how we deal with each other. And finally, we need to redesign our institutions, like the economy, education, government, etc. When you redesign these three systems, you will have a better chance to move forward into this just, sustainable, flourishing era. Okay? So now, how do we redesign these three systems? So I'm going to talk briefly about this particular competency called ontological designing. It is one of the most important ones. Like I said, we have 7 of them. This is one of them. The other ones, for example, like systems thinking, plays a big role also in how we impact the system. But today, I'm going to focus on the ontological designing. So the first principle of ontological designing is to see that each and every one of us as a human being is a designer. And in our culture today, we don't see that. We don't give ourselves that permission to be a designer. The culture says only a few people can be designers. In our philosophy here, we're saying everyone can be an ontological designer because, in fact, we already are. We are already ontological designers without knowing it. So here we're going to be, you could say, a conscious and aware ontological designer. So from now on, after this seminar, you should feel honor that you are an ontological designer. So give yourself that title and that permission so you can design. Now the next question is, so this is the first principle. And the second principle is that we can design our social world. Okay? We can design our social world. So anything that is in our social world, beginning with me, for example, the individual, myself, the concept of self. So for example, Manuel, my concept of Manuel is a product of my own ontological designing, whether I am aware of it or not. So once I understand that the self that I am, the individual, can be redesigned so that the individual in the society can be redesigned, it opens a huge possibility for me, for my life, in my world. So the important part here in this principle is to see, one could use the metaphor that my life is like a work of art. Imagine if my life is like a work of art, then it's open to design. Or if my life is a product of design, then who is the designer? I am. Now, I can design my mindset, I can design my thinking, I can design my beliefs, I can design my attitude, I can design my conversations. As you can see, I could go on and on and on, and you will see that the human being that we are is an amazing human being because it is flexible, it is adaptable, it is malleable, and it has a property that other animals do not have, which is the capacity to reinvent ourselves. And I would like to say we have the capacity to redesign ourselves. Just because I was born, for example, in a particular culture, doesn't mean that I have to stay the rest of my life with this cultural baggage, if you will, or this cultural narrative. I can transform myself and transform not only my mind, my thinking, my consciousness, but also I can transform my understanding of who I am. So we have a lot of freedom as human beings, and unfortunately most people do not take action, do not take advantage of that freedom. So this principle, number 2, that we can design the individual and the society, opens a huge possibility for us because we don't have to behave or be the self that the culture gave us. Like one of my teachers, Robert Keegan, who is a teacher of psychological development, he talks in his book about the evolving self, about how most people stop changing and growing at level 3, mind level 3. And at mind level 4, Keegan says, we have the opportunity to be the self-author, the author of our own mind, the author of our own being, our own self. To me, that's a perfect theory that is complementary to ontological designing, because we have that power. And let me explain one third principle. So another third principle of ontological designing is the fact that what we design, so whatever we design, it has a systemic impact, and it comes back, and it also designs us. So there is a circularity in this principle of ontological designing, because what we design comes back and redesigns us. Now, once you understand this principle, it makes you hyper aware that what we design is important, because it's going to come back and influence how we are. So this systemic flow has both positive and negative potentials. So once we are conscious of this, then it behooves us to be able to design things and systems and objects that come back and design us in a positive manner. So we need to be careful about what we design, because design could be used for positive or destructive issues. Now, most of us are not aware of this, you could call it this feedback loop from this principle that what we design comes back to design us. So once we're aware of this, we can say, okay, so what is the culture that I want to design, because this culture is going to come back and design me, for example. So we now become more conscious of the values in that culture. So for example, if you design a culture that is for aggression and war, it will come back and shape you to be a human being that is shaped for aggression and war, which is what we have today in the industrial, also in the empire era. So this is the empire industrial era, which is characteristic by the design of domination, oppression, aggression, for example. So we want to transform that. So what we design designs us back, goes also to institutions. So if you design, for example, a system of government, that government is going to come back and redesign you. So if you design democracy, democracy will come back and make you into a democratic citizen, hopefully, okay? So the same thing with education, etc. So this principle is highly important, and one could say that it is, in some cases, very slow in the feedback loop. In some cases, the feedback loop is very fast. In some cases, it's very slow. So for example, in the industrial era, if you apply this principle of what we design comes back to design us, in the industrial era, the economy is designed for growth and quantity, and is designed for us human beings to be what? To be consumers. To be consumers, and who constantly consume more and more and more. So in this era, we are being designed to be unlimited growth consumers, and this is what we then contribute to the unsustainability of the planet. In this sustainable, just flourishing world, we can design the cultures in here and the values and the institutions, so they come back and design us to be virtuous citizens. Citizens who, instead of wasting, are conserving. And we are more sustainable in our minds, in our practice, in our cities, etc. So this is a very important principle. And the fourth principle that I would put over here is that one of the most important tools that we have for us to design with, when people ask me, well, okay, this sounds all good, but how do I do the design? Well, we use the power of language. So language now which is another competency in evolutionary leadership, is another competency by itself, generative language. But here language, because we humans are linguistic beings, we now become more hypersensitive and more aware that it is through language that we design and construct our social realities. It is with language that we begin to create and co-create together this social world that we live in, called culture, called society, institution, and including the self that we are. This self cannot exist without a family, a relationship, a family, etc. So you begin to see that we are existing in this system of language. So now language becomes one of the most powerful, you could say, instruments or tools for designing who we are, designing our social construction of the world. So we in evolutionary leadership spend a lot of times then applying this competency to not only ourselves but to other projects, other social domains. So finally, I want to conclude by saying that what are the possibilities for us to apply this ontological designing? The possibilities are that we can design a new kind of self, a new kind of human being, one that is loving, ecological, collaborative, systemic, global, etc. This is a possibility that we can do. We can also design our cultures. So that's an important element. And we also need to apply what we call whole systems design. So when we talk about applying this competency with language and systems thinking, for example, you begin to see that this area here of worldview, cultures, and institution is a whole system. It's a macro systems design. So we can say, we can apply this to the redesign, one could say, of a whole society. This entire system, whole system, equals a whole society, a whole civilization. Okay? So finally, there's many opportunities, because when you study evolutionary leadership and you begin to apply this, you may say, okay, how do I apply this? Well, you may apply it to a project, like in your community. You may apply it to your own personal self. You may apply it to a relationship. You may apply it to an organization where you work, because wherever there are people and humans who are engaging in the process of conversations and language, they are engaged in the process of constructing and designing their reality, their social reality. And most people are not aware of that. So you, as an ontological designer, doing ontological designing, you can have an influence on organizations, projects, communities, cultures, society, and including artifacts. The artifacts that we need in our society, especially in a sustainable society. So for example, we can redesign our cities to be ecological cities. We can redesign our technology. So there are many opportunities for us to redesign. The key point, my final point, is that when you look at this world that is possible, the design of a just, sustainable, and flourishing world, you will see that it is something that we have the power to design and to build and to create. But we're not going to do it alone. We need to collaborate. We need to work together. But the main important theme that I want you to take away is that this is a project for us to design together. And I hope that you take this knowledge and continue further your readings. I mentioned some of my teachers. They have excellent books. I encourage you to read them, and I encourage you to study with us and continue to study with us and take our courses and our seminars. Yeah, okay. So let me give you a framework for how we can study together and use this video. So this video will be about 20 minutes, that the one that you're going to be seeing. So we encourage you to see this video before the 1 hour seminar. And then in the 1 hour seminar, we are going to come together and we are going to apply these principles that we talked about here. We're going to apply this to specific areas of your life. It could be a project, it could be your own personal issues, and we'll have an opportunity in that 1 hour to not only learn from each other, but to further explore how you can apply this to different domains of your life. So that will spend the hour that way. And of course, we also invite you to take the longer course that we do, the Evolutionary Leadership program, which we intend to produce this year. That will be a 3-day program where you will have a greater opportunity to go into depth into the 7 competencies and see how they all relate to one another and connect to one another, and that way it will give you a greater sense of how you as an evolutionary leader can have a positive impact in redesigning our world. Thank you.